Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. We're delighted to be sponsoring this jointly between the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and the Committee on Career Advising and the Committee on Affirmative Action and Diversity, this forum on microaggression in the classroom. We have two great presenters today, Cherie Marlowe, who is our Assistant Campus Diversity Officer for staff and students, and Christy Bird, Assistant Professor of Psychology. And so largely I'm just going to turn it over to them, but I do want to say I'm very sad to announce that Cherie has another job opportunity. She's going to be leaving us at the end of the term. But it's a really great opportunity for her to go off and be a Chief Diversity Officer at Clark University. So it's a great opportunity for her, but we're going to miss her greatly.
Good afternoon, everyone. Very excited to be talking about microaggressions in the classroom, but I first want to give a disclaimer that this class that I normally do is 3 hours. So we're going to be trying to do this in 40 minutes for my section, and then Assistant Professor Christy Bird is going to talk about our research. So you're going to get more overview concepts. We don't really have, based on the setup today, really an opportunity to get really deep into these concepts, but to at least frame the conversation, and then I can give post resources if anyone's engaged in wanting to learn a little bit more and get a little bit deeper into the topic. And so a little bit about my background. I've been here for now almost 3 years, but again, as Herbie announced, I will be leaving to be a Chief Diversity Officer at Clark University. I'm also a licensed attorney, and I practiced law for over 5 years as a litigator and then transitioned into higher education because it really aligned with my passion and my core values of really seeing a practical application of these concepts. And so I want to give a little frame of what we're going to be doing again. I'm going to look through microaggressions through two different lenses. First, through Dr. Su's work, which is most of the research is based on his lens of microaggressions, and then briefly introduce microaggressions, looking at it through the critical race theory analysis, which that's just emerged in research within the last 5 years. And so again, I'll give overviews of both of those concepts. So first, the term of microaggressions, even though it's been a more popular term that's been circulating in the last few years, it's actually been around since the 1970s with Dr. Chester Pierce, and he really wanted to dig deep into the experiences of African Americans based on the history of our country. And so really to see over time, he looked, because he's a doctor and a psychiatrist, so he looked at what are the medical impacts, what are the physical or psychological impacts of hearing terms that are stunning, they're aggressive, and they're verbal or nonverbal that happen over time to affect the Black community. So he really wanted data to show what are those effects over time. So again, I wanted to give the history that this term has been around for a while. And then in the 1980s, it extended to looking at other marginalized communities. It extended beyond, because if you look at the historical context, again, we'll look at some of these terms as they come up, it will make more sense of why it needed to be extended to other marginalized communities and how it can affect them in the same way. So I'll go over the exact definition by Dr. Wing Su, is everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, and insults. They could be intentional or unintentional. Usually, a lot of times, they're unintentional, and they communicate hostile, derogatory, and negative messages to target marginalized communities. So I'll give an example of what an environmental microaggression may be. So it's, say if you go into an academic department, I'll just pick on the STEM fields. I don't know if anyone's from the STEM fields in the room. If you go into the STEM fields, say an engineering building, you know that most of the engineers throughout history have been white males. And so if you go into an engineering building as a student, whether you're a female or a person of color, and you only see white males all lined up on the walls, and their faces and their research or their contributions to this field highlighted, you walk into that space already feeling like you don't belong. And so that's an example of what an environmental microaggression, again, it's unintentional, but the impact is huge for marginalized communities. It sends a message, again, that you don't belong. And so here's another way of saying it. Simply stated, microaggressions are brief, everyday exchanges that send denigrating messages to people of color based on the racial minority group that they belong to. I want to give Christy Bird some acknowledgement. She actually made the form that's on your table, so a lot of these concepts are going to be laid out on there that I'm going to go over now. And so there's actually 3 different forms of racial microaggressions. There's other types of microaggressions. Again, given our time, we're not going to go into others. You can look at people with disabilities. You can look at gender. You can look at sexual orientation. So again, there's other forms, but for our purposes of today, we're going to focus on racial microaggressions. So breaking it down with 3 different forms of racial microaggressions is a microaggression microassaults, and that's where you're referring to, that's more of the traditional, I would say old traditional racial terms where you're being very explicit using the N-word or other racial epithets and things like that. A micro insult that communicates and conveys rudeness and insensitivity in its demeaning. So if you say, again, example here, saying to a person of color, I believe the most qualified person should get the job. If you don't say that to everyone, why are you saying that to the person of color? And then a micro invalidation. It communicates that it negates their very existence. And the importance of looking at the forms is to know when you look at the micro, say if it's a micro insult, when you make that comment, or if a comment is made, whether verbal or something happens, the person that's targeted, that's what they feel at the end of the day. They feel insulted, or they feel invalidated, or they feel assaulted when they hear those comments over time. And that's the importance of looking at breaking down what types of forms, and so you know the impact. This one is more commonplace, but again, it's helpful to know where these concepts come from and where do biases and microaggressions come from. Looking at research, again, early life experiences. Most of us, even if you look at higher education, for whether that's for students or faculty, this can be either your most diverse area you've been in or the least diverse area you've been in. You look at microcosms or where you grew up. Most people grow up in communities that are homogenous. Everyone's pretty much looks or comes from similar backgrounds, and so you get influenced by your environmental surroundings. You get influenced by media. An example that I usually give is I try to give current examples of how the media can influence us. So if you look at the example, I think it was now a year ago or two, where we had it may have only just been last year, we had the bombing in San Bernardino, where it was Muslim identified individuals that had, not bombed, but killed, like a mass killing, and it was immediately termed as a terrorist attack, right? But if you look through research throughout history, it's been mostly white males that have done mass shootings. But they usually term them as they're an exception to the rule, or that person has mental or emotional health challenges. The conversation is framed very differently in the media of how you look at individuals versus, again, San Bernardino, it's like calling for all Muslims to be tagged and targeted, but you don't have anything of saying target all white males and they're all dangerous, right? That's a way that media influences. Cultural biases. When you walk into a space, you usually know who holds power. I won't say that for higher education, but you know you're in spaces of who holds power and who doesn't. Again, it's looking at your surroundings, passive observances, as well as yourself, your family, and your friends. So again, these are implicit. We get indoctrinated with these concepts. It doesn't mean that anyone's particularly bad. I think at least in California, most of us don't experience explicit racism or explicit homophobia, but it's a lot of implicit, subtle things that constantly are happening that get unchecked. I took out a lot of my quotes. I'm a person that loves quotes, so I'll say one of my quotes today, is these exchanges are so pervasive and automatic in daily conversations and interactions that they are often dismissed and glossed over as being innocent and innocuous. And so you'll see as I go over some examples a little bit later on of how these comments can get glossed over, or maybe someone's thinking, oh, why is that person being so sensitive, right? And then the biggest thing is what I want to say is why that's important is it's not about the one-off statement, it's about the cumulative impact. We'll watch a video a little bit later that highlights a stat that actually I'll just wait for you to see it and then I'll re-talk about it. But basically looking at the cumulative impact. So if you overhear a statement where someone says to someone that is, they weren't native born in America and they have an accent, and then you assume their intelligence or their level of intelligence based on saying something about, oh, you speak good English, or where are you from, or where are you really from, things like that. You might be the 100th person that has made that comment. So again, it's not that one off, it's constantly hearing those comments that again impact the person that hears them. So I listed all the research at the bottom that looks like, why are we even having this discussion? And we have to look at the effects and the impact of microaggressions. So it really it affects your mental health, especially for the one that's being targeted, if you hear those comments over time. I'll give you an example that happened for me. I have quite a few, but I'll give two. One example is educationally, I went to law school, and I had the dean of students there. I will be big disclaimer, I didn't do well my first year. I was an English major, and English major and law school are completely opposite. So English major, you get rewarded for, using elaborate language and descriptive. And I remember my first law school paper said verbose. And it just, that's issue, rule, application, conclusion. It just is very concise. And so I didn't know that it wasn't that I was intelligent, I just didn't know how to write like a law student yet. And I had the dean of the students bring me in and say, I want you to be successful, especially for your people. It's really important, and you're already $40,000 in. I'm really, for your best interest, I think you really should consider other options so you can be successful other places. And then they take me out of my cohort. Once you get on academic supervision, you get taken out of your cohort of only 20 students, so everyone knows you're taken out of your cohort. And I was put in, quote unquote, a special class to see if I can get my grades up. And even though it was an embarrassing situation, it was a blessing in disguise. I had an amazing faculty member who just asked me one simple question. She goes, have you ever considered your learning style? I said, I don't even know. I was a first gen. I was like, I don't know. I've never considered that question. And so she went through the whole class and just went through learning styles, and I realized I'm not an auditory learner. And all law schools, auditory learning, and they're using a whole lot of Latin, res judicata, and all these words that I'm like, I don't understand what the professor's saying. So I realized all I needed to do was record the sessions, have my Black Laws dictionary, translate it, and then it ended up on Dean's List every single year after that. And so if I took that message that I heard, and that, again, slight language, she wasn't like, you don't belong, but it was like, we really want you to be successful, especially for your people. We want great, I could have internalized that message and ascribed my own intelligence based on that. So again, that happens. Another one I get is, oh, you don't look like a lawyer. I'm like, well, what does that mean? I don't know what a lawyer looks like. And again, it seems like a very innocent comment, but it has a lot of weight to it, right? Hostile and invalidating campus climate, perpetuate stereotype threat. I don't know how many of you attended Dr. Claude Steele's talk. I think he did that just a couple months ago on looking at, like, basically, if you're from a marginalized community, being afraid that you'll confirm that stereotype. Like, one stereotype that I get afraid of is it's a stereotype that African American women are loud and obnoxious and unintelligent. I'm just a loud person. I come from a loud family. My grandmother had 11 kids, so I have a lot of aunts and cousins, but I can be afraid if I'm loud, that's going to give this whole stereotype that comes along with that. So again, it can affect you, and then there's a lot of studies of how it can affect your academic performance as well. Physical health problems as well as work productivity and problem solving. So again, there's been well-documented research on the impacts of microaggressions, so it's not just that one-off statement, it's the cumulative impact over time. So I have a brief video. I originally took it out, but I put it back in actually right before you came because I said it's really good. It's from middle schoolers talking about microaggressions. Hopefully I can come back to that. Where's my little, there we go.
Oh, you're so pretty for a black girl. Oh, she has a Jew nose.
Oh, your hair would look so good if it was straight.
Jews are so cheap. Why are you so cheap?
Do you speak good English?
How are you an Iraqi Jew?
I think the person saying microaggression kind of doesn't really think about it.
This person who said it was my friend, like, I was astonished they would, like, say something like that.
You don't want to make a big deal about it, but then it's also like, you just said something that offended me, so I feel like I should speak up.
Because they're micro, because they're very subtle, they're small, you feel like you don't have a reason to be upset. You're overreacting, and people even can make you feel that way when you bring it up. I'm like, oh, you can't take a joke.
You're making too big of a deal of this. Why are you overreacting?
Don't take it so seriously. It was just a joke. Chill out. Say like, oh no, I actually love black people. I love people of color. Like, they try to just minimize the situation.
If someone feels hurt by a microaggression, it shouldn't just be pushed to the side.
It definitely has negative impacts, and it leads to people disliking who they actually are. Those kinds of subtle offensive comments can build up over time. They can have like a deep psychological effect, and they can make you feel bad, and they can make you doubt yourself.
We try to just use jokes to like make things less awkward or like ease social experiences, but it is important because you need to like be aware of what you're saying and like who you're speaking to.
Think of what you say and how it can affect the person you're saying it to.
Just briefly, can I get at least one or two people to comment on that video? I know most of you are still eating. Anything that sticks out? Yes, it particularly was focused on all girls and middle schools coming out. One of the comments that came up before when I teach this class is that these children so young have already been experiencing microaggressions and can articulate the impact because we're starting to talk about it, but it's a twofold. It's good that they can articulate and name that, but it's also very sad that they're experiencing that at such a young age. And so just understanding that it affects us all on different levels. Very quickly, I'm going to look at critical race theory. So critical race theory can take an entire year to talk about. I'm going to talk about it in 2 minutes, just to frame the discussion and make sure to help us see how it shows up in framing microaggressions to the critical race theory. And so with critical race theory, the two things that I want to highlight is that it challenges dominant perspective, because in America at least, most of our educational settings, in our work environments, how policy and law is shaped is through a very European-centric dominant perspective, right? And you can even think of that with what you were taught in English. I remember whenever Black history came up, I only knew about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. I mean, there's a whole lot of other pivotal people in the African-American Black community, but those are the two that I learned about throughout education, through K through 12. And so again, it challenges the dominant ideologies and deficit perspectives of, oh, these poor people and let's give back to them, versus there's been people that are speaking for a long time, their voices have just been silenced. It looks at and it affirms the lived experience of that individual. What you saw in the video is one of the things that stuck out to me is the girls were like, you need to validate that experience. And so part of the critical race theory is validating that the person that is experiencing that, it's real, it's true, it's not to be challenged, because they're the person that actually has to receive those comments constantly, or again, invalid, whether verbal, nonverbal, and environmental. It also looks at intersectionality. It's not even though it's critical race theory, it doesn't look at just race. It looks at how it intersects with sexual orientation, how it intersects with gender, how it intersects with socioeconomic status. And you can imagine if you are someone that comes from Spain versus someone from Mexico in our country, it's a very different experience, even if you frame the discussion on who's an immigrant in our country and what that looks like historically and how you're treated based on which continent you come from. And so again, it looks at the intersectionality of the discussion and its explicit commitment to social justice and interrupting the systems that are in place, not just the individual, but the policies. And a lot of times, I'll give you one example of a policy is when, I believe it was in the, just lost it right now, 1950s, I believe, where they were doing studies on mainly Black women, as well as Puerto Rican women and indigenous or Native American women. They were doing studies, the government was funding studies where they were making them sterile because it was to advance science, right? That's a policy. That's not just an individual, that individual doctor is bad. It was funded by our government, right? Let's look at interrupting policies that are perceived as beneficial to advance science, but impacting entire communities and dehumanizing them, right? So looking at microaggressions through the critical race theory is, again, looking at it on a systemic level, not just the individual. So with Dr. Su's work, and I won't go over that slide too much, with Dr. Su's work, he mainly focused on therapists, mainly white therapists that were giving care to patients of color. And so to help them to understand how their services may be impacted by who shows up in your space. So I'll give you an example. Just last year, I usually try to stay up current on the news. There was someone, I believe I want to say it was Alabama, where there was a woman who went and got checked into the emergency room. She happened to be a Black woman, and she said, I'm not feeling well, and I need to go to urgent care. She got checked in, and the doctor didn't believe her and said that he believed that she just wanted to get prescription drugs and get medicated. And so they ended up, and she said, no, I don't feel well, and they tried to forcefully remove her from the emergency room. They ended up calling the police. The police officer forcefully removed her from the emergency room, put her in the back of a car, and she ended up dying in the back of the police car. That's why we talk about microaggressions in the medical field, is how you perceive whether you think someone's just coming in to quote unquote get drugs versus someone that, if someone came in from a different community, more of a dominant community that said, I'm not feeling well and I need to be admitted, receiving different care, right? So he looked at through microaggressions, through in this field called the perpetrator, and looking at them becoming aware of the impact of their actions, right? Or their verbal, nonverbal, or their behaviors. Looking at it through the microaggression, the critical race theory is looking at it as what is the experience of the individual being targeted. And the individual being targeted is both the primary and the secondary target. So the primary target obviously is the person who's receiving that comment, but example of a secondary comment or a secondary target, I'll give an example. I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to give a legal case. It just was in I don't know how many of you heard of the stop and frisk law that was in New York City from 2010 to 2012. It was sort of this law that said we can do stop anyone and frisk anyone if there's reasonable suspicion, right? So in the course of 2 years, they stopped 1.6 million people. Of the 1.6 million people that they stopped, 1.3 million were Black and Latino, mainly male. And 84% of those stops were considered suspicionless. There was no finding of any suspicion, right? And so when you think about a secondary target, it's not just that person that's getting stopped and frisked, it's their child that's right next to them, it's their friends that are with them, it's the person that has to witness that and the impact that that sees, especially if you have a child and they see that. You think of someone that's a peace officer and they're supposed to protect and serve, but you see your family member being stopped, put in handcuffs, and not understanding. So that's, again, a secondary target of someone that's environmentally being influenced by what they're seeing, right? So that's what the critical race theory does, is look again at the person who's targeted and validating that experience, or the one that's a secondary target. Really quickly, I don't know how I'm doing on time. 5 more minutes? Okay, I'm going to try to speed through this. Microaggressions, looking at specific examples to the educational setting. One example is an Indian American student born and raised in the US is complimented by an instructor by speaking good English, saying, oh, you speak good English, right? The message is, even though you think that might be a good comment, it's sending the message that that person does not belong, that they're a foreigner in their own land, right? Saying to a woman of color, wow, I would have never guessed you got your master's degree from Harvard. These are actually examples that are taken from real situations, so they're not made up examples. So women of color are seen as less intelligent, not capable. When a white staff member says to a colleague, well, I don't think of you as Black, or I wish you were more black people like you, right? You're exception, you're not like others. From a faculty member trying to make conversation with a Latina PhD student, my gardener is from Puebla, Mexico. These are real examples taken from research. Right, assumption that all Latinos are Mexican, number one, and that they all know each other. An instructor speaks to a student who uses a wheelchair as if the student were a young child, talking to them as if they're less, right? Not intelligent, not adults. This one really got me. An instructor raises his or her voice and speaks slowly when addressing a blind student, right? Person with a disability is defined as lesser as aspects of mental or physical functioning. A few more here. From a program director about an Asian coworker with a Korean accent. I guess we won't have Dr. King making phone calls anymore, haha, right? Perpetual foreigner assumption of incompetence based on their accent. I'm sure that happens especially with faculty member if you have an accent with students in the classroom, describing your own intelligence. A lesbian couple walk into class holding hands and give each other a brief hug and kiss, and this happened on our campus. And a faculty member says in front of the entire class, take that somewhere else, really loud. Versus, and again, do they say that to everyone? If there's students that just give each other a quick hug and kiss and leave the classroom, do they say that to everyone, or was it just for this lesbian couple? Few other examples, and then I'll turn it over to Christy Bird. This one happened at UCLA. Faculty of color mistaken for a service worker. An advisor assigns a Latino postdoctoral student to escort a visiting scientist of the same race, even though there are other non-Latino scientists in the person's specific area of research. You ask, I always get, what was wrong with that? It's an assumption that just based on their ethnicity that they're going to have a connection versus they're scientists first, right? From a chair of a search committee, you can't pronounce an ethnic-sounding name. Wow, that's hard. Is there anything else I can call you? Right. When a female student asks a male professor for extra help on an engineering assignment, he asks, what do you need to work on this for anyway? Right, and the last one, an advisor asks a female student if she is planning on having children while in postdoctoral training. I didn't understand the significance of this until I went to the Expanding Potential Conference. I spoke at that in Berkeley just last quarter, And a PhD student, she spoke and she was on the panel from Harvard, and she said, I didn't really experience a microaggression didn't realize the experience of microaggression until I got married. She happened to be Indian American, and all of a sudden she was on all these pivotal research assignments or had a PI. I don't know, I'm not in the STEM field, so if I get the language wrong, my apologies. But she was working on a lot of different projects, and then all of a sudden after she got married and she was Indian American, they said, well, aren't you going to have children soon? Are you really going to be able to work on this project? And she didn't realize, just by basis of being married and also Indian, that all of these assumptions and microaggressions with them, she would experience those based on that one change thing. One last thing is microaggressions can be a powerful tool for people of color and marginalized community because it gives them an opportunity to actually name their pain. So now I'm going to turn it over to Christy, who's going to give some more of her research, and then I'm going to close with some coping mechanisms.
So thank you. So I'm going to talk some about my research on microaggressions and what we've been finding on this campus. So this idea of how do schools teach about race and culture, what are interactions like across racial and cultural lines. I'm primarily focused on early adolescence and older adolescence, and of course college students kind of fit into the older adolescents, young adults, emerging adults category. And so what we've been doing on this campus is to really think about how do students experience microaggressions, what types of things do they experience, and then are there ways that we can help them to deal with those experiences. So this first slide is kind of a summary of what Cherie's already talked about, what are the effects of experiencing microaggressions. Plenty of research to say that, it doesn't feel good to be the target of a microaggression. People really feel like, why did they say that? Is this someone, that I can trust? Is this someone I want to be around, to continue being around? When it's an environmental microaggression, it's the question of, do I belong in this space? Do I want to go into that building where I'm going to see these pictures? Can I function here? And so the biggest thing that I want you to know about microaggressions is that they create an extra burden for our students. They are, trying to be successful in this environment just like everyone else, but they have this added burden of having to worry about whether they're going to experience these comments. So what we're trying to do in my research is to really address some of the limitations in the existing literature. So a lot of the literature is really based on recall. So you sit people down in a focus group or you have them fill out a survey and you say, okay, what have you experienced in the last 3 months, the last year? And if I ask you about something that you experienced 3 months ago, you might not have the best, way of, you might not remember it extremely well. So part of what we wanted to do in this research project was to get more in the moment measures of how often are microaggressions happening, what happens with microaggressions. Another need in microaggressions research is really how do different groups experience microaggressions and how they respond to them. A lot of the research on microaggressions has been on African American people. There's some expanding into Latinos and LGBT groups now, but we don't know from a wide range of people, how do they experience them, what kind of impacts do they have on different outcomes. So we're also interested, like I said, in kind of getting those more moment-to-moment measures of microaggressions. And in research, they've dealt with this by doing what's called a daily diary study. And so this is basically where people will sign up for a study and they say, for 2 weeks, we're going to email you every day to fill out a survey. So every day you're going to tell me, did you experience a microaggression? Did you experience this? Did you experience that? And that can be a great way to get more day-to-day level data, but it's not something that you can do for a long time. Most of them last about 10 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Because when you ask people something every day, it becomes more salient to them, right? It's hard for them to continue responding. You have a lot of people who drop out of those kind of studies. And so there are some definite limitations in trying to ask people over a long period of time, every single day, did this happen? So that's not the best way of getting at it either. And then the last thing that we want to do is think about an intervention for how do we help people to really deal with microaggressions. So far, all of the research has been on what are the effects of microaggressions? What do they look like? We don't know how to help people deal with them. She's going to give some of the coping strategies that people can use, and this is based on the research of people just saying what they do. But we don't know how effective those strategies are. We don't know how people can respond to different types of microaggressions in the moment. And so part of what we wanted to do in this study was to be able to get more data on how is it that people respond, what are the strategies they use, how effective are they, but also could our study in itself be an intervention to help people to deal with microaggressions. So these are the goals. So using a mobile app as a way to test microaggressions, to study microaggressions and to test an intervention. So I remembered to bring my phone. This is the app. This is the Android version. So it's called Micro Report, and it's basically consists of two things. There's a map of all the reports that you can see other people have reported anonymously on there. So when you click on a marker, it shows you the description of the report, and it also has a list of all the reports over here too. So part of it is that the participants can see what other people are experiencing, but then the part that we are most interested in is them reporting on their own experience. So this is the form where we just ask them to describe what happened. Don't use any identifying information, but tell us what happened, and they can link it to their current location based on their phone's GPS, or they can choose a building on campus and say, okay, I was in this building. And then we encourage them to check the different categories of what it was related to. Not too many people do that on a regular basis, but then we ask them how much it bothered them, so we can get a sense of, what was the immediate sort of sense of how angry were you, or what was your feeling about this microaggression. So we recruited participants from all across campus. I had some research assistants who just went to every student organization, to a bunch of classes, and said, come be in this study. The only criteria was, do you want to know more about microaggressions? Are you interested in this topic? So we had almost 300 participants who signed up for the first survey. And so we gave them the app, told them how to use it. We said, anything you think of as a microaggression, just based on your own definition, we told them a little bit about it, but we really said, whatever you feel is offensive, whatever you feel like is targeted toward your identity, report it. And so they've been using the app since November. We're giving them a bunch of surveys. So we started with a survey when they first signed up. We did a survey in winter quarter, and we just finished the third survey actually last week. Actually, yesterday, I should really say. Everyone finished yesterday. So the surveys, their perceptions of the campus, academic outcomes, psychological well-being, their identity beliefs. We have a lot. It's a long survey. So we have a lot of different ways of understanding what is their experience like on this campus and as being students. And then every quarter, this is part of the intervention side, is that we are holding 2 workshops. So the first workshop is just sort of basics. What are microaggressions? Here are the themes. Here's the previous research on it. Here's what our research is trying to do. So they can get a deeper understanding of what do we already know about microaggressions. And then the second workshop is what I call the self-defense workshop. So this is where we say, yes, the research hasn't really given us good information about the strategies that people can use, but here's some ways to think about how to respond. So we talked to them about, there's some research on appealing to people's values. So when you're the target of a microaggression, if you can say to someone, oh, I didn't think of you as the type of person to say something like that, that creates what's called, it creates a value discrepancy, right? So most people think of themselves as really nice, fair-minded. So if you tell someone, oh, I wouldn't think of you saying that, then it makes them think like, no, that's not me, that's not me. So this kind of creates this idea for people, this motivation for people to apologize, for people to try to repair their relationship, so they can be confronted with their own bias. Just stating your feelings. Again, most people don't want to hurt their friends or the people they're around. So by acknowledging what the impact was, targets can really help the aggressor to understand what's going on with them. Using humor, giving information. I'm sure you'll talk about some of these too. But we really try and stress that even though you don't want to respond immediately or confront them in every situation, it is a good thing to try and say something, right? To not let the comment pass for your own health, because people will think about it. Once a microaggression happens, it's not just over, right? You have to think about it. You have to wonder, was I crazy in that situation? Did they really say that? Did they really mean that? That's less likely to happen if you confront a person. But also for that person, since most microaggressions are unintentional, if you never say anything, if you never just sort of mention like, hey, what you said was, it hurt me, or I think it wasn't okay, that person wouldn't learn from that situation. So we do try and talk to the participants about the value of confrontation, but realizing that in every situation it's not going to be safe or what you want to do. Sometimes you just want to get out of there. And that's totally fine. But part of what we want to do is to help the participants feel empowered that there is something they can do. They can respond. So that's the first part of the intervention. And the second part of the intervention is the app itself, right? So we're hoping that by being able to report on here, by knowing that other people see it, by knowing that I am taking the data and presenting it to people like you, they can feel that there is something being done, that their experiences are not just being ignored. So we're hoping that that can help them feel a sense of social support, but also help them feel more positively about this campus as being a place that is supportive of them. So that's some things we're going to be looking at. So now, with my brand new data, I have some things to show you. So this is based on the third survey, which I said just finished yesterday. This is based on the people who had done it before Tuesday, I think. But so we had 211 who have completed the third survey, and they're all undergraduate and graduate students, mostly undergraduate students. Most of them using iPhones. We have a very diverse sample. It's actually slightly more racially diverse than the campus as a whole, but we do have representation from the largest groups on campus and then some other groups as well. And most of them are, more than half, are first-generation college students. So as I said, we have given them 3 surveys. I'm going to show you data from the first survey, comparing their outcomes in the third survey. But first, let me show you the map. So these are all the reports that have been submitted since the beginning of the study. So each of these markers is at least one report. There's some, if there's more than one in one particular place, they'll be doubled up. But I just wanted to let you see some of the things I see here. Microaggressions are happening all over campus. A lot of our participants told us, oh, it's only going to happen in certain places, or it's never going to happen, around here. But the microaggressions are happening everywhere. They're happening in academic spaces. They're happening in social spaces. They're also happening off campus. It's true, there is a lot going on over. We also have a lot of psychology students, so that could be another another thing going on.
Are they also reporting when they're off campus?
Yes. So my second map, this is Santa Cruz. So they're also reporting things when they go home. We have our map is all over the place, but I just kind of highlighted. This is some things that happen in Santa Cruz. And so these are all different types of microaggressions, right? So we have racial microaggressions, gender microaggressions, microaggressions based on disability, sexual orientation, and they range, right? Some of them are from strangers, just yelling something. Some of them are from close friends who make a joke. Some of them are from faculty members, right? Who one example, in a classroom, only calling on male students, those kind of things. All different types. And so part of what we want to do is to be able to analyze what types of things people are reporting. But of course, since we have the location data, we can say, okay, where are things happening? We're going to have to draw some lines and kind of boundaries to sort of say, okay, what types of areas is this more likely to happen in? We do ask the participants, where is a place that you feel safe on campus, right? So I'm hoping to map the safe places that people name with these kind of reports too, just to get a sense of, where are we doing well, right? And how can we make those places be bigger, basically. So that's the map, and now I'm going to show you some of the findings in terms of student outcomes. Oh, what? More reports. So most people have made a report at least. Most of them are actually not making a lot of reports. So the mean is about 2 reports per person. And how much it bothers them, they use the whole scale, 0 to 100. So the mean is really in the middle there. But what's interesting is that we do give them a survey measure of racial microaggressions, and their number of reports is not correlated with their report on the survey in terms of racial microaggressions. So there's a lot of reasons that could be, but I just found that interesting. So in the video you saw, that was they had a statistic from one of the articles by Bloom, something about 291 microaggressions over 3 months, like 3 per day, something like that. We're not finding that students are experiencing 3 per day as individuals. It's possible that they're not reporting everything, but we do think that our data gives a different perspective on how frequently these experiences are occurring. So they are occurring every day, like the app is updated every single day, but for individuals, they may not necessarily be happening every day, but they still have an impact, and that's what I want to show you with the outcomes. So what we did is we looked at the relationship between the racial microaggressions they reported in Survey 1 and their outcomes in Survey 3, controlling for their outcome in Survey 1. So this is the change in all of these outcomes over that period of time. And so what we found was that experiencing racial microaggressions was related to lower self-esteem, was related to lower feelings of confidence, more depressive symptoms, and more stress. So these are microaggressions that they were reporting in November or having an impact on them in April and May. Right? So there were some where it wasn't significant to feelings of belonging and to happiness, but I think that overall, what we're seeing is that microaggressions really do matter. They really do matter for how students experience their day-to-day lives, right? And of course, there are other factors that go into their feelings, right, and whether they can cope with this, and that's something that we want to look at too. But I think that the takeaway here should be that for our students, and this is for the whole sample, for our students, experiencing microaggressions really does impact them, right? And as faculty, as staff, as people who are here to help them get the education, we also need to pay attention to their mental health needs and to what their experiences are so that we can help them get that best education and be mentally healthy while they're doing it. So I do want to thank Cherie and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, our participants, and this is my research lab, who have done a ton of work to make this study possible. But I also want to thank you and just let you know that we're going to continue with this work. I'm going to be doing workshops like this all over campus. We've been doing them, and I just want to make sure that that you understand the importance of thinking about microaggressions, but realize it's really hard to deal with. But as a community, part of what we can do is to work together to really make our campus the best it can be. Thank you. Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, so do we have any questions? Yeah, definitely. So the question is about how do you deal with microaggressions as a faculty member between students in your classroom? And I'm summarizing for the video for y'all since I'm recording that. So there's multiple strategies, right? So one is to set guidelines at the beginning of the class and say, we want to have a respectful conversation, and I'm going to, I might have to remind people if we cross those, we break these guidelines. So just setting it up at the beginning, like, okay, we want to have that there. And then when those kind of situations do happen, it is important for the faculty member to intervene. There have been studies where, these are studies where they ask students, okay, imagine this situation. How do you feel when a faculty member does this, when they don't do this? And doing nothing had the most negative response, right? Students want to feel that someone there has their back. And it can be really awkward, right? Because you don't want, you have to think about the aggressor's feelings too. You don't want to embarrass them. And so that's where the strategy might be to maybe say something very briefly during the class, but then take that person privately aside to address the comment. But I do think that saying something, even if it's something like, I think that, this is a tough situation, I will always use the, wow, this, it seems like things are getting really emotional right now, or let's take a break and think about, and kind of take a step back. Or how do you feel in response to that comment, right? Those kind of things where you aren't necessarily saying, okay, you said something bad, but hey, let's stop here for a second. That's something that I tend to do. But I do think it's really important for faculty members to intervene, and you have to do it sensitively. So the other strategy is to maybe say something very briefly there, but then to go to the target and say, how would you like me to address this situation? So if you go to the target afterward, then you could possibly, they might say, oh, I don't really care that much, or you could sit down with them and the other student to talk through it. So you have a lot of power in the classroom to set a norm that what's okay to do. So, but it is very, very awkward.
I agree with all of what Christy said, but another strategy as well, it's similar to what Christy was saying, is if you have to look at the impact of the statement in the context of how it happened. So sometimes it might be just where that one individual may have been impacted, but I heard, in one of the classrooms last year, it's sort of focused on an entire community, like entire undocumented student community, and there happened to be quite a few undocumented students that were identified in that class based on the subject matter of that classroom. And so when it was something that affected the majority of students, the faculty member didn't feel like they had the tools in that moment to deal with it, but they said, what I want to do is revisit in the next class. They acknowledged it and said, let's revisit this. Here's a couple things I want us to think about so that you could talk about it and table that so people can really sit on it and make sure that you address it appropriately in the next class that comes up. So I've seen that strategy be effective as well.
Yeah, you since you have the floor, you don't have to respond right away. You can always say, let's come back to that.
So since I teach a lot of diversity trainings, I've had to deal with that situation quite a bit, because when you're sometimes you feel like it's a safe space, but when you're talking about sensitive subjects, depending on where your proficiency is, some people tend to make comments that they didn't necessarily intend to harm, but are really harmful. And so I just had a situation last quarter, and I got mixed reviews on how I handled it, but mostly positive, because sometimes you're caught off guard of, wow, how do I deal with this situation right now? And one of the ways I like to do it when I see someone that really isn't aware that their target harmed, but it really was impactful, is I try to take a step back and use a more general term. I say, I just want to take a moment just to let us know, because you can see the faces and the facial expressions of people that are like, oh, that hurt, or that didn't feel appropriate. Say, I know that we're all in a learning space. And I feel like I want to just take a moment to just talk about and go back to some concepts. And again, mine is very specific on diversity. You might be teaching on a very different subject and say, in this space, a lot of times we can make comments that seem like X, Y, and Z, and I try to make it more general, and then I make sure that I talk to that individual afterwards, but I say, let's take a moment to just talk about broad concepts for a second and realize how they can impact larger communities, even if we don't realize it, and that's sort of my transitionary language to address it. Usually the person knows I'm talking about them, but in a more general concept so they don't feel as targeted.
Yeah, so the question is about how do you deal with students, with people who are talking about experiencing a microaggression, but also, may say some problematic statements or make aggressive, microaggressive statements on themselves. And I've dealt with that. So I have a student who, is very aware of LGBT issues and, is all over campus, talking about, really an advocate for, but identifies as a man and sometimes says things that are offensive towards women, right? And that's where that relationship is really important, right? Sometimes you can only deal with one thing at a time. So you definitely want to acknowledge the experience that they're having, but if you are, you have to realize it's never a one-time conversation. And this is what makes it difficult in classrooms and that sort of thing. You don't want to spend your whole time talking about identities and everything, but having people, it takes a while to learn. Everyone is learning, and everyone's learning at different rates in different subject areas. So being able to have multiple conversations about something is like, okay, let's deal with your hurt right now, right, and just kind of have that emotional first aid. But maybe a little bit later in the conversation, or maybe the next conversation, to say, actually, when we were talking about this other thing, you said some things that were that I, wanted to talk a bit more about, or here's some things that you might want to think about as well. That's the best way that I've thought to handle it, because it is hard to deal with a lot of things in that one situation. If you just try and say like, wow, you shouldn't be saying this, while they're trying to process the first event, it can just create more harm, and then they can feel like, oh, well, you're not supporting me. And it's like, yes, I'm supporting you, but I'm also trying to challenge you to grow in this other area. So that's why that relationship is really important. Yeah.
Really briefly, I'm also going to go over some coping mechanisms and go over some topics or strategies to interrupt microaggressions. And I think after that might be helpful for both Christy and I to come back up to either if you want to ask specific about her research or anything that came up in the conversation today. So the coping mechanisms that I took from was from a specific research article. It's called Striving to survive and thrive in academia, the collective voices of counseling faculty of color. So again, it was a research on a specific group of faculty, but I felt like the concepts that they came up with and the results from the research were can span to other groups to learn from what they said. And I want to take from what Christy said is, again, this is not necessarily strategies of how, we don't know if it's effective or not. It's just how did these individuals deal with microaggressions when they came up in the academic spaces, particularly for faculty and some graduate students. Because again, it's not just faculty on student or student on student, it's faculty, it's amongst your colleagues as well, and how to speak up, as well as some of this is important especially when I go over the interrupting microaggressions, is many times it needs to be the bystander, the person that overhears it that speaks up. Because if you're the one harmed, you're still processing in that moment, because again, microaggressions are so subtle. So you might even be processing in that moment, did that just happen? Am I being sensitive? What just took place? And so someone else might be able to easily identify, and it empowers that person to think they're not the only one that has to speak up to their pain or validate that. Others are validating that experience as well. So one of the main coping mechanisms that came up from this article, or the research that I read, was actively seeking support and getting support from your friends and loved ones. That was the highest of going to trusted members that you know, right? But if you're in a community, like I don't know many people in Santa, this is not my direct community when I moved up here, and so all of my community lives further away. So if you don't necessarily have that, that might not be the space that you constantly have right when you're going into class or right when you're going into a meeting or something like that. So, but for most of everyone, that was the most support that they drew from. Another one they called was safeguarding self. And so I'm just going to actually read this one out because I felt like it was really important. Is this self-protection that participants aspired to in order to safeguard self was not reducible only to the risk junior faculty felt due to low status and the vulnerability of being untenured. It included the vulnerability of being different from the norm, so intersectionality, right? And the need to protect oneself from overt and covert racism experienced individually and systematically. And they also said decoding their experiences, what I said, trying to understand it, sorting out academic rank, gender, race, and the vulnerability of looking different, and the need to protect yourself. And so it's sort of that process of how do I feel safe or safeguard myself in this space that I'm still trying to understand, especially when you're untenured and you're still trying to, there's power dynamics, there's many other intersecting, what do I want to say, many other things that are basically taking place during that time. And so I thought that was really important, is just understanding what does it mean for that individual to safeguard and feel safe for themselves, given those different things. Another one was distancing yourself. And when I read that, I said, well, is that healthy? And I said, well, actually, when I read that, distancing yourself is kind of, sometimes in order to do your job, you need to distance yourself emotionally from the situation. And some did that through focusing on their work, focusing on their research, because as Christy pointed out before, you're not always in a space to respond, whether you're the target or the bystander. And so sometimes you need to distance yourself so you can function and have that kind of like self-care, have your own self-care. And there's times that you do want to speak up and just figuring out what is that balance for you, right? Others said becoming politically savvy, knowing the ranks. I mean, as you know, most of you have been at Santa Cruz for a while, every different space has their own academic you have your said and unsaid rules. You have your spoken and unspoken community, and really understanding the ropes. And sometimes that empowered someone to feel like if they understand what the academic life was and the dominant culture of faculty members, they felt more secure when a situation took place. They felt empowered. I know as a lawyer, when I was empowered with information, even if I felt very insecure, even insecure about my case or whatever, but when I had knowledge, brought confidence and brought security in a situation. So that's how I equate becoming politically savvy. Another coping mechanism was affirming one's sense of selfhood. And again, a lot of this is you already know this, but it's saying it and knowing that you have these tricks in your pocket when they come up, is remembering who you are and where you came from. I have to constantly remember that. And again, this is not saying that this is anything intentional, but when I came to Santa Cruz and I got hired as a staff here, there's only 37 other black staff on this entire campus out of over 3,000 employees. And then on our campus that is very decentralized, I can go weeks without seeing someone that has the same complexion as me. And so that can bring up your own sense of, do I belong here or what? You know, you just have to constantly reaffirm who you are. And so when something happens, it doesn't have just, you know, unravel you. You can really keep affirming yourself, your own pride, your wholeness, your integrity, etc. Maintaining connection with your community and your culture of origin, if that's something that speaks to you. Another really thing that was powerful was naming the problem. Speaking up and standing up to those, and they put in quotes, like me. I have my own problems with that term, but this is the research. And so, again, they did note, and I put it in red, typically the participants who did speak up were tenured, right? So they noted that. But that is a tool and a coping mechanism. Hopefully will interrupt the systems where you don't have to be tenured to feel like you can speak up to different things that are taking place. Finding, building, and maintaining your support network. So that comes with, you know, seeking support and mentorship. A lot of individuals in academia have your mentors, whether they're formal or informal, and have your faculty that you can really go and talk to about anything. So that may be available within your department, but they said it also might be available within your spaces at other institutions if it's not available at your own institution. So again, finding connections at other universities outside of your department. That was one of the reasons why we actually created the mentoring program for faculty, for assistant professors, to have it cross-departmental, so you have a mentor that's already engaged in your success, but doesn't affect your tenure or your review or your promotion process. And so that's one of the strategies, behind that, having someone that's already engaged in your success. In this one, they called it attitudes and internal qualities, actions that help create and maintain them. So what are your own focus? Staying focused on why you're here, your research, you know, drawing from your inner qualities, your self-efficacy, and your sense of optimism. So they're just kind of more, some said meditation, things of whatever that looks like for that individual. And then the last one was striving for and maintaining balance. And that comes in a lot of different ways. I mean, they said through outside support, through what do you like to do, just making sure you remain yourself, because a lot of times, especially for students that are still developing in their identity, when something like that happens, it can throw them all off course. That affects their academic performance, affects their social engagement. And so having a state of balance in that, again, is coping mechanisms. We don't know if any of these strategies have been successful, but these are the ones that have been reported from the study that they utilize. The last slide I have is different sides of how do you interrupt microaggressions. This is taken from Sylvia Hurtado, who's in UCLA. And she's come up with a lot of these terminologies. I only highlighted a few. They're actually, which I forgot to print it out, so I'll send it to you. There's actually a whole double-sided sheet. I believe some of you, if you went to a previous workshop, might have already gotten that. But ways to interrupt microaggressions are to ask the speaker to elaborate. Can you say more about that? Can you help me to understand, right? And my personal style is I don't like to accuse people, because to me, even if you're not dealing with sensitive matters of race and gender, sexuality, if anyone accuses you, you automatically get defensive. Think about interactions with your loved ones or your children or whoever. You know, if you accuse, the immediate wall goes up. So I like to ask open-ended questions and not assume guilt, because I know that I might mess up sometimes too, and I don't want someone to assume that I meant wrong either. And I'll give two examples after I give this. Is to create a different way to look at the situation. Have you ever considered another way of looking at this, right? And then a clear, non-threatening way to directly address these issues is to focus on oneself rather than the person. It communicates the impact of the situation while avoiding blaming or accusing. So I'll give two examples. I'll give one where I was perceived as the perpetrator, and one where I feel like I was the target. And so I was doing a diversity presentation, right, as the diversity officer, speaking at a chancellor's event, and I kept using the term "you guys." And then a student came up to me afterwards, and they were yelling in my face, and they were telling me how offensive I was, and they were cursing, and I could have said, wow, that's really inappropriate, because I did feel like the behavior was really like, okay. And I could have got defensive, because like, I'm a diversity officer. No, what? And I said, well, actually, I'm really sorry. And I said, I don't want to put this on you, but if you feel comfortable, what are other terms that you feel like would be helpful? And if not, I will go and look that up myself. And so I took the onus. I said, if you feel appropriate, and they did take that time, that space to tell me. I said, I probably can't say y'all. Y'all doesn't roll off my tongue, but I will focus on saying everyone, folks. And I still have to constantly curve my tongue, because it was embedded in my vocabulary for over, decades of years. I won't say how old I But you know, it takes time to curb that. But again, I was perceived as a perpetrator, received as meant harm, and I could have responded very defensively, but I believe in taking responsibility for the intent and the impact. I didn't intend to hurt, but it still had an impact where it caused harm, where that student felt excluded. Another one that just happened at the Anita Hill event, that was last year, right? When Anita Hill came on campus, I believe. So I was speaking, I was no longer working in my capacity. To me, after, if you go to an event, I'm just going as to enjoy that event, didn't have my name tag. Oh, actually, that's what happened. I left my name tag on, so it said Campus Diversity Officer. So this person does not work at UCSC. They were a community member that ended up coming to the event. They sat next to me and they said, oh, I see your tag, you're a Campus Diversity Officer. She happened to be a white woman. And the first thing she said, I didn't even get her name yet, she said, I just want to let you know that I'm from Oakland and I understand the experience. She goes, I've been living in Oakland for the last 20 years and I understand the experience of when you feel excluded and you feel like you're the only race. And she goes, I feel like I am a white minority. And she was like really intense, doing her arm like that. And I was thinking, it's like 6 o'clock. Do I want to deal with this? And she kept using the term white minority. And she goes, I really understand what you've gone through. And I turned over to my colleague and I thought, do I want to address this right now? I don't really know. I don't know this person. I haven't even gotten their name yet. And I'm tired today. So I talked to a colleague first and I thought, oh, it was nudging me. And I said, oh, I don't know how this is going to go. So I'm going to just try to address it. So the first thing I said is, I'm not going to say this person, I actually didn't know her name. So I said, oh, would you mind if I reopen the conversation that you just had? I want to learn a little bit more about the term you said about white minority. Can you explain to me what you mean by that? And that was my first thing, even though I was feeling a lot of different emotions. In that moment, I wanted to make sure it was open-ended. Can you help me to understand? And then she went over this whole lineage of, I said, oh, do you mean minority in number or the experience? I said, oh, are you comfortable with hearing a different way of thinking about this? And she goes, oh, are you going to challenge me? I said, no, not challenge you. I said, I just want to see if you're open to a different perspective on that term and how it operates historically. And I won't go into everything I said, basically. So I thought she got it. I left it alone. I felt like she was still feeling very defensive. It's kind of funny. She ended up sending me the next day a CNN article. And I then sent her research. But, you know, and I was like, at the end of the day, I stopped the conversation. I felt like I did what I could, and it wasn't worth going further. But it was just an example of when I was still feeling a lot to still not accuse and say, whoa, do you realize that's really off? But just a way to say, can you help me to understand? So that was my way in that moment of trying to interrupt a very uncomfortable situation. And so this is my last slide. Again, there's more examples of how to interrupt microaggressions, but I wanted to turn over. We have 10 more minutes to see if you have any questions for Christy or I for anything that you heard today or comments about the talk we had. Right. Yes, it is. So the main question is in the academic space with the faculty, if a faculty member says something that's unintentional, creating a space where a student might feel comfortable with speaking up if it happens. Did I understand that correctly? So I have my own terms, and I know, well, I'm not a faculty member, but I have from research and what I've seen that helpful when I teach and facilitate discussions, is I try to say that, similar to what Christy was talking about earlier, is lay the ground rules ahead of time. Anytime which I didn't do it today, usually when I give a presentation, I usually say, if you have anything, if I say anything offensive or anything that you have to say with me, please feel free to come and talk to me because I definitely want to hear it. So I kind of lay the foundation at the very beginning that that's okay. But I don't necessarily have the same power dynamic with a faculty. I'm in a diversity class, so I don't know if Christy, you specifically want to speak to the power dynamic that is at place, because a student might feel afraid to come up to a faculty member that could affect their grade, or how that might be perceived, or if they'll be perceived as too sensitive, or what does that look like. So I don't know if you want to.
So I guess what I would just add is that, you know, being open and having them see you as someone that they can go to, feel comfortable going to, will, you know, help with that situation. But you can also tell students, like, okay, if I say something that's offensive and you don't feel comfortable going to me directly, here's my friend who will tell me the truth, right? Or if you want to send an email to this person, you know, they can tell me and not tell me who it was. So if you can set up as many avenues for communication as possible, that will help students feel comfortable. And you also have to make, acknowledge like, okay, yeah, I know it's really awkward. I know I have power over your grade, but I care about being better, being the best faculty member. So I guess if you set it up that way, just make them give as many opportunities as possible. So we're not going to go the route of like sort of in the moment letting you know, but we do ask the participants at the end if they're okay with us sharing their reports. So at the end, we'll be able to, kind of have a list of these are the things that people have experienced on this campus, so that you can see examples. I think that, a lot of people have anxiety about, oh, did I say this particular thing? Was that offensive? But I don't want to sort of downplay our participants' experiences, but a lot of the themes are very similar. So I think that if you see these lists of kind of things that people are hearing, you can just recognize in your own experience, oh, I might have said that, or I might have done this, without having very, very specific details. I think that the kinds of things that happen are common enough that you would be able to learn from them.
I also want to add, and it goes somewhat to both of the questions, is when a student sees that you respond and like with compassion and empathy and taking the responsibility for the intent and the impact, that does give more courage for individuals to speak up. Like I teach a class on the historical overview of power, privilege, and oppression. And given the demographic breakdown and the compositional diversity on our campus, it was majority white students that were in that class that felt very uncomfortable speaking up in that space. And I tried to make it as comfortable as possible to talk on a very sensitive topic. And so some did feel comfortable, but others came up because I tried to model, and they were like, I was afraid to speak up. And I don't feel like I'm a very intimidating person, but that's my own subjective opinion on myself. But in that space, some felt uncomfortable. And so when they approached me and said, I felt uncomfortable because of, and other students overheard my response to the student, then I saw a group of others coming up because they saw that it was safe for them to speak up based on my response in that situation. So, all right. So I'll summarize what I heard is that when you're in a dominant culture in academia and an instructor that comes from a marginalized community speaks or tries to introduce a different learning style that's different than the dominant or the more traditional term of teaching that particular subject, and students challenging that as not being acceptable or not being perceived as prestigious or accepted in that space when that comes up, and how to address that. Is that? So my first take is it's actually very interesting on our campus, and I think we actually need a little bit more data. And across the system, usually when microaggressions come up, it's mostly student on student or faculty on student. We have an interesting paradigm on our campus where it's a lot of student on faculty, specifically faculty of color and women faculty in the STEM fields and other fields where students are attacking their own faculty. And so that's been brought up. I serve on a lot of system-wide committees, and my colleagues are generally shocked that that happens quite often on our campus. And so we've been trying to figure out how do we interrupt that when it takes place. And part of it is empowering the faculty member doing trainings, even though it's hard to do trainings when faculty are already very busy and have their time very taxed, of how to empower you with language when that does come up. A general way, that's a very specific, and I would want to more talk offline with you on the specifics, but a more general, I would say, is elaborating in the very beginning of the class of why you're doing what you're doing. I would say, and that's usually when you're educating a more diverse student population, I'm hoping that actually all of academia changes, where we have the ebb and flow of how we teach when the composition of your student population changes. And that's actually based on research. And bringing in research into the conversation of why it's important that we continue to ebb and flow in this field and what that looks like. Because generally students respect research. They expect when you explain to them, this is why we're doing, you might already be doing that, but this is why we're doing what we're doing, so they can understand the foundation versus, wow, this is different than anything I've ever experienced. It looks different than the dominant. And that was where the critical race theory comes in, is challenging dominant ideologies and what's considered the norm, and there's a different way of doing it, but creating that foundation for that. And I don't know if you have anything.
Yeah, so I would say setting up the why you're doing this, but also get your senior colleagues to have your back. Find someone who can either come into the classroom and say, "Oh yeah, I really support this style of teaching," or someone who can, be the person that they complain to if they can be supportive of you. And I know that might be difficult, but I think that's when you're untenured, you have to get other people to help you.
I'd like to add one more thing. Especially if it comes into your course evaluations, I think that's where the cultural proficiency building needs to take place. If the individual that's reviewing your file understands that there's biases that take place in that, and understanding the context of those coming up. And I think that's an education that can happen across all of the academy, of understanding how to look at a review package. And again, it just extends beyond hiring and promote. It looks at the promotion and what that includes in asking more questions if that does come up, or being able to be empowered. And I don't know if you're untenured how empowered you are to say, here's the context of which that came up, and I want to expand on that. So.
Oh, yeah, I think that would be definitely a good suggestion to make to the people who make those policy recommendations. I think it's important because part of the problem with bias. Oh, and so sorry. The comment was having faculty have the ability to exclude comments in their evaluations that might be seen as offensive or biased. And I think that could be a really good solution, because part of the problem with noticing bias is that, if you're just a group looking at the evaluations, you may not, that group may not notice it, but you might know as a faculty member, or if there's a pattern of it, you might be able to see it then, and it makes it really difficult in that individual level. So I think that could be a good solution. It wouldn't fix everything, because sometimes the comments could be coming from, they might just say something like, "Oh, well, I don't like him," or "I don't like her." And that could be coming from bias too, but you wouldn't be able to, exclude it because it's explicit. So, but I do think that, if there's some option of sort of tagging explicit comments, making people aware that, hey, this was in these evaluations, it could be affecting the scores, since we do rely so much on those numbers, that could be useful from my perspective. Yes.
So those of you who don't know me, I'm Herbie Lamb, the Vice Provost for Academic Affairs. I do have a role I'm also the Campus Diversity Officer faculty, and I have a role in the personnel process. So I have a lot of these different pieces here. There is some policy that would make it complicated to be trying to remove particular evaluations. And so I think the best recommendation we have is to contextualize it as part of your review as faculty. We ask that you provide a personal statement. And if you think that there's an issue with what some of the students have said, please discuss it. Please bring it up. Give us more context so that we can evaluate the rest of your file in that context. And I think that's really the most helpful thing.